to the chapter revision for theme 4 from your textbook on Themes of Indian History, part 1. This chapter is called Thinkers, Beliefs and Buildings, Cultural Developments circa 600 BCE to 600 CE. So the chapter opens with a glimpse of Sanchi. We are told about how Sanchi is an example of successful restoration and preservation by the Archaeological Survey of India. It briefly talks about the contribution of two of the Nawabs of Bhopal, Sultan Jahan Begum and Shah Jahan Begum, and the fact that John Marshall was located on site while he documented what he found at Sanchi. And the study of Sanchi Stupa using the sources of John Marshall and other later scholars has really revolutionized and transformed our understanding of Buddhism today. But before we start talking about Buddhism and some of the other heterodox sects which were contemporary to it, let's talk about what the background was, from where uh, was religious belief in India kind of originating from. Of course, it's always very difficult to pinpoint origins, but let us look at some of the mainstream religious beliefs in India and the world which were contemporary to Buddhist ideology. So, scholars believe that the first millennium BCE was a turning point in world history where across the world you have a profusion of philosophers and thinkers such as Zarathustra in Iran, Kongzi in China, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in Greece, and Mahavir and Gautam Buddha, among many others, in India. Now, each of these philosophers, in their own ways, by giving their own arguments, were trying to understand the mysteries of existence and the relationship between human beings and the larger cosmic order. Now, this was also the time of great upheaval across the world. This was also the period of what we understand as the Iron Age. Many civilizations are coming up at this time, urban civilization. In India, of course, new kingdoms and cities are developing. Socio-economic life is rapidly changing. From pastoralism, people are moving into settled life in the Ganga Valley, and this is leading to a lot of social upheaval as well. So, old norms and rules aren't really working to fulfill the new requirements of these new changes. So, thinkers were attempting to understand these developments and trying to offer an argument as to why these changes are taking place, what people can do to kind of make sense of these changes, and how they can conduct themselves if they can survive these changes. Now, existing at that point of time were some Vedic traditions based on the Rig Veda. Rig Vedic period we mark as around circa 1500 BCE to 1000 BCE. The early important deities in the Vedic traditions were Indra, Agni, and Soma. These were largely representations of certain natural phenomena. For example, Indra was the god of rain and the thunderbolt. Agni was the god of fire, and Soma was a god of a certain intoxicating drink whose formula, of course, has been lost, as scholars say. Now, when you look at the structure and nature of the early Vedic religion, it was largely materialistic. Yeah. So when people offered their prayers or recited shlokas and performed fire sacrifices, their main concerns were getting more cattle, getting more sons, um, being successful in battles. And sacrifices were largely associated around fire. Fire was seen as a messenger, who is a conduit between humans and the gods. Sacrifices were performed by individual householders within their households, or you would have larger public sacrifices performed by kings like the Ashwamedha and the Rajasuya. But when you have times are changing, and as we've already talked about how new urbanization is appearing, new kingdoms are being established, there's a lot of upheaval in society. New questions begin to emerge now that perhaps food sources are getting more guaranteed. Perhaps humans are delving into deeper questions as to what is the meaning of life, what is the purpose of life. When we come on this earth, we have a finite period. So why are we born, right? What happens to a person when he or she dies? Was there rebirth? And if it is rebirth, was it due to past actions? And also trying to understand and expressing the nature of what is the ultimate reality. Is there any ultimate reality? They were also speculating on how important was the sacrificial tradition, in fact, even questioning the sacrificial tradition. For example, if you're looking at agrarian society where cattle is considered to be extremely important. You cannot have agricultural operations without cattle, whether it's the bull which is pulling your plow, or the oxen which are pulling your plow, or even the cow which is which is a source, a very important source of food in rural households. And here you are when you're talking about various sacrifices and giving away of cows. What does it do to the regular farmer who probably owns only one or two cows, and he has to give them away to some priest who's performing certain rituals for him? So there is a question. So these new ideologues or philosophers like Buddha and Mahavir are actually questioning that what is the purpose of this? Right now, if the farmer is going to lose his cattle, how is he going to carry on his his agricultural operations? Yes, so there is a lot of questioning of the old order. What also emerges when we look at the text of that period is that many of the texts are written in question answer form, or in discussion, or in debate form. Now, when we look at the Buddhist texts, they mention as many as 64 sects or schools of thought which were separate from it. Now, how do we know these 64? How have we counted these 64? Because a number of Buddhist teachers, Buddha himself, and of course many other Buddhist teachers, are shown having a dialogue or a debate with some other philosopher. Yes, and they're arguing out. And of course, scholars have kind of gone through these texts, and they have identified 64 different schools of thought. There may have been many more whom these Buddhist texts have not recorded. Perhaps they'd never encountered them, and therefore they never got recorded. What we also do understand when we look at Buddhist texts is that teachers traveled from place to place. So the philosophers would travel from place to place, trying to convince one another as well as other persons or lay people about why their philosophy was valid. Yes, most of these debates took place in groves, or what is known as a Kutagrashala, apparently a kind of a hut with a pointed roof. And they would sit there and debate, perhaps often for days at a stretch. And if a philosopher succeeded in convincing one of his rivals, then the followers of the one who lost would also become the disciple of the successful philosopher. So the size of a certain philosophical group or a certain sect would either increase over time or simply disappear if their philosophers, if their teachers were not very good debaters themselves. It was likely that hundreds, if not thousands, of sects actually disappeared because they got absorbed by other sects, because their debating teacher had lost the debate. So that's also a very interesting practice. If you read The Argumentative Indian by Amartya Sen, at least the early chapters, he actually does talk about the nature of these debates. Now, in all these debates that were taking place, many of the teachers were actually non-Brahmin teachers, and they would question the authority of the Vedas. Right, the Vedas were composed in a certain socio-economic situation. Now that has changed, right? So Vedas seem to have been composed in a more pastoral kind of setup. But here, when you have settled life, agriculture, cities, and empires emerging, somewhere the Vedas don't seem to be fitting in. So they begin to question that. And they also began to emphasize individual agency, that you can do it on your own. You don't need a god, or you don't need someone else to help you reach certain answers. So it is you who is responsible for your life. Now, this was in marked contrast to the Brahmanical position that our existence, that each individual's existence is determined by his or her birth in a certain specific caste or gender, which is again defined by probably what you've done in your past life. So, if you've not been good in your past life, you're likely to be born either a woman, or to be born as a low caste person. But a lot of these new teachers, new philosophies are questioning this particular idea of this predetermined, existence because of your birth in a certain community. Now let's come to Mahavir very quickly. And according to Jain tradition, Mahavir was not the only person in who was a Jain philosopher. In fact, he is traditionally supposed to have been preceded by 23 other teachers who were called Tirthankars. And the word Tirthankar literally means those who guide men and women across the river of existence. So somebody who teaches you how to live your life, so that you can live a good life, and you can accumulate good karma, and therefore attain freedom from the cycle of birth and death. Now, what were some of the basic teachings of Mahavir? This, of course, is a very popular question in the board exam, so you would do well to sort of learn this part up. The basic teaching, of course, is ahimsa. That of course the 20 Tirthankars generally, and Mahavir in particular, of course, believed that the entire world was animated. So even stones and rocks, water, they're supposed to have life. And ahimsa, of course, means non-injury to living beings, especially to humans, animals, plants, and insects. Yes, and of course respect towards stones, rocks, and other inanimate objects as well. They believe that the cycle of birth and rebirth is shaped by karma. This is again something that is common both with Buddhism as well as Brahmanical belief, that what you do in your previous birth is going to impact your future birth as well. What Mahavir, of course, talked about is asceticism and penance. He said that this was essential to free oneself from the cycle of karma, right? Or to free yourself from the cycle of birth and rebirth. And asceticism and penance could only be achieved if you would renounce the world. Therefore, monastic existence was considered a necessary condition for salvation. Now, when you renounced the world and became a monk or a nun, you were supposed to take 5 vows. So you're supposed to abstain from killing, stealing, lying, observe celibacy, and to abstain from possessing property. Jainism, of course, spread through much of the country, especially in Western India and the Deccan. Even today, when you travel around there, you see a profusion of, ancient monasteries and temples to signify that Jainism was a very important belief system in these parts of the country. We have also found a wealth of literature in a variety of languages, starting from Prakrit and Tamil to even Sanskrit in the later centuries. And for centuries, these manuscripts have been carefully preserved in libraries attached to the Jain temples, which is how scholars in the modern times have come to be able to read these manuscripts and understand the nature of this religion better, and perhaps the historical significance of these religions as well. Some of the earliest stone sculptures, which were associated with religious traditions, were actually of the produced by the devotees of the Jain Tirthankars. So perhaps the Jain iconography, Jain images were perhaps the first ever sculptures, divine or semi-divine, to be found in the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent. Let's move on to Buddhism. So Buddhism, as we know, as you've studied in your previous classes as well, spread far beyond the Indian subcontinent as well. So in China, Japan, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Central Asia, and Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, of course, is a Buddhist state itself. What are the sources of which help us to reconstruct, the history of the religion itself? So when we look at Buddhist texts, again in multiple languages, including Sanskrit. We have translated and analyzed them, and historians have also tried to reconstruct the details of his life from hagiographies, from sculptures, as we shall see when we discuss Sanchi in a little more detail. Many of these stories were written down at least a century after the time of Buddha, so almost 100 years later. So we don't really know how much of these are true and how much of these things are uh, you know, uh, uh, attributed to Buddha may not really have happened, but later teachers, perhaps to drive home a point, to teach someone through parables, perhaps attributed some of the events to Buddha's life itself. So it's very difficult to actually sift between that. And the kind of stories that we have come up with Buddha's life. So, whether even Buddha was a historical personality. So, largely today, all historians believe that yes, Buddha was a historical personality. And we do have some common elements of, stories about him dealing with his early life. That Siddhartha is born to one of the rajas of one of the sanghas. So, it's a more oligarchical situation. So, he was born to one of the rajas and leads a very sheltered life till, as is traditionally known, in fact, his father did not let him out of the palace, because there had been, some of the astrologers had said that either he'll become a great king or he'll become a great ascetic. So his father wanted to protect him from the harsh realities of life so that his son would become a king and not really an ascetic. But anyway, Siddhartha does manage to escape the confines of the palace, and when he sees the world outside, he encounters certain things which disturb him and make him think. So he sees an old man. So he comes into, so he begins to realize that, his youthful body will turn old one day. He sees a sick person, so he understands disease. He sees a corpse, so he comes face to face with the idea of death. And then he sees this homeless mendicant who's supposed to have come to terms with, the things that he was getting upset with, about old age, about sickness and death. So he tried to look for answers, that why do people get old, or why do people get sick, or why do they die, and why was that homeless mendicant, at peace with himself? So what is that secret of his peace? So he explores several different paths, and he comes upon the path of dhamma, or the righteous way of life, right? Not a set of rituals, but really a way of life. So this is from where you get the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, that you may have been familiarized with in your earlier classes. So let's look at some of the key teachings of the Buddha. Much of this we get from the Sutta Pitaka. So he talks about the concept of miracles versus reason, right? So there is a story about the inevitability of death. So there is a mother who's lost her child, and she approaches Buddha hoping for a miracle, that he will be able to bring her child back to life. So what Buddha does is, rather than give her these long lectures about how death is inevitable, he asks her to bring a fistful of mustard from any household which has never seen death, which has never had anyone, any loved one die. So she goes from house to house, seeking, a fistful of mustard from any household where there has been no death. And every house she goes to has a story of death. Somebody has died of old age or sickness, or some accident. Then she returns to Buddha and says, well, I have not found any such house. So that's when Buddha is able to illustrate to her that everyone experiences, the loss of a loved one, and it is inevitable. So come to terms with it, and we need to move on in life, right? So the basis of Buddhist teachings was, rational reason, rather than hoping for miracles, or rather than blind faith. So what is Buddhist philosophy? When we talk about the fourfold truth, four basic truths of Buddhist teachings, that is, the world is transient or anicca and constantly changing. So the only permanent thing they say is change. That the world is also soulless. There is no soul here. There is nothing permanent or eternal in the world. And within this transient world, there is sorrow or dukkha. Now, this dukkha is caused by desire. So the moment your desires remain unfulfilled, it leads to sorrow. Yes. And that is intrinsic to human existence. In human existence, you cannot completely cut yourself off from desire. And when your desires remain unfulfilled, it causes you sorrow. So what is the way out? That by following the path of moderation between severe penance and self-indulgence, that humans, if they can give up their desires, they can rise above these worldly troubles. And what is interesting is that Buddha never really talks about God, that there is a God above and you should worship. So when we look at, if you were to ask the question that what did Buddha think about God, that question seems irrelevant, because Buddha never mentioned God, or at least none of the texts that scholars have studied on Buddhism anywhere actually talk about the existence of a God. In the previous chapter, we looked at how the social contract theory, where we talked about how social hierarchies came into being according to Buddhist thought. So coming back to that again, that the social world is a creation of humans rather than of divine origin, that there is human agency, which is why humans can even actually change situations, or change social structures, if the time so demand. So Buddha advises the kings and Gahapatis to be humane and ethical towards their people. He asks for individual effort, which will transform social relationships. So there is nothing predetermined. There's nothing that God has said, therefore, and you can't change that. So Buddha always talked about individual effort and agency. And he said that righteous action was the means to escape from the cycle of rebirth and attain self-realization, or nibbana. And the word nibbana literally meant extinguishing of ego and desire. So when you're able to completely let go of ego and desire, and therefore you end the cycle of suffering. So according to Buddhist tradition, his last words before he died were, "Be lamps unto yourself, and all of you must work out your own liberation." So work out your own path. So it's very interesting that he says that, right? That he worked out a path for himself, so can anyone else. But the key, of course, is to let go of ego and desire. Now let's look at the followers of Buddha. Of course, there were hundreds and millions of lay Buddhists who treated Buddha as a teacher, tried to follow his injunctions as best they could. But there were also a special group of people, the bhikkhus and the bhikkhunis, who formed the Sangha. Sangha is organization largely based on the kind of Sangha that Buddha was born in, an oligarchical system, details of which we will come to towards the end of the slide. Now, those who had become bhikkhus and bhikkhunis were supposed to renounce all worldly goods, and they were supposed to live on alms, which they were allowed to collect only once in a day. So they couldn't spend the whole day collecting alms. And in return for receiving these alms from the lay people, the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis were also supposed to spread the message of Buddha, give them teachings. Perhaps if somebody is, is in trouble, looking for advice, is in sorrow, the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis were supposed to help them, right? Now, initially, only men were allowed to join the Sangha, but later on, women were allowed to on Ananda's intercession. Gautam Buddha was not really in favor of allowing women into the Sangha, but Ananda successfully, persuaded Buddha to allow them as well. So Mahapajapati Gautami was the first bhikkhuni. Mahapajapati Gautami was actually the foster mother to Gautam Buddha, who becomes the first bhikkhuni. Now, bhikkhunis are known to have become theri or respected teachers as well. So it was not as if the bhikkhunis were given a second class status within the Sangha. So they could rise from being an ordinary bhikkhu and bhikkhuni into theris. The followers belong to all walks of life. So we have kings. We have Ashoka, of course, as the foremost example of a king who becomes a Buddhist. Wealthy men and Gahapatis also are followers of Buddha. We also have humbler folk, workers, slaves, and craftspeople who are not only lay followers. In fact, among both these categories, the elite and the commoners, many of them actually renounce the world and join the Sangha. And once they joined the Sangha, all were regarded as equal because they were supposed to have shed their earlier social identities and egos once they became bhikkhus and bhikkhunis and took their vows. Now, the internal functioning of the Sangha was quite democratic in nature. So, if there were decisions to be made, they would arrive at a consensus through debates and discussions. And if they couldn't arrive at a consensus, they would even take a vote. So, quite revolutionary if you come to think of it. But the point is, when we're looking at so many people who are not only joining the Sangha, but millions who are lay followers, what was it about Buddha's teachings that people were so attracted towards Buddhism? One, it seems that they were dissatisfied with existing religious practices, especially the sacrificial tradition could be extremely expensive, especially for the poor people. So they found Buddha challenging the sacrificial tradition extremely attractive, and especially when you're talking about animal sacrifices, and animals could be an asset for a poor person. And if you have only one uh, a bullock or something, and you are sacrificing it, how do you then survive, right? So definitely the common people, of course, found Buddha's challenge to the sacrificial tradition extremely attractive. Many were also confused with the rapid social changes. Now, again, if you look at today and you look at a lot of these new age gurus, why are people flocking to them? Perhaps life has changed so rapidly in the last 30 years, in the last 20 years, that people are finding it difficult to come to terms with these changes. And therefore, to either de stress or to find some work life balance, they are flocking to these new age gurus. So perhaps Buddha also offered them this kind of a solace that, okay, this is what is happening. You are desiring things, your desires aren't being fulfilled, so you're facing some amount of sorrow. So try to separate yourself from that desire. Buddhism also attached importance to conduct and values rather than superiority based on birth. So you were not an upper caste, for example. Your varna, what Buddha said, should be determined by your actions, by your righteous actions, and not by where you were born. So this, again, especially for the downtrodden, this was a very, very revolutionary message, that your status in society should actually depend more upon your conduct and your values and your contribution rather than where you were born. Buddha also laid a great stress on metta or fellow feeling and karuna and compassion. especially towards those who were younger and weaker than yourselves. So again, this was extremely an extremely attractive message for people at that time.